What happens when 300 million Americans watch as one senator stands alone and exposes corruption right in the heart of Congress? The night J.D. Vance shattered Karoline Leavitt's career wasn't just another hearing. It was a moment that made history pause. A moment that made families, veterans, and workers across the nation stop and feel what justice truly means. Under the blinding lights, with the eyes of a country fixed on him, J.D. Vance chose truth over comfort, integrity over silence. And in just minutes, he revealed a betrayal that shook the nation. You're about to relive that night. The decisions, the courage, the downfall. Before we begin this powerful journey, remember, what you're about to see is a dramatized story, a work of political fiction inspired by the kind of courage and challenges that define real public service. The names, events, and moments have been imagined to bring you closer to the heart of the fight for justice. But the emotions, the questions, the values, those are real. And maybe as you watch, you'll ask yourself, what would I have done in his place? Let's step into the chamber and witness the night that changed everything. Stay with us. What you're about to witness is more than a story. It's a test of courage and of truth. Dawn over Capitol Hill wasn't gentle that morning. The first rays of sunlight battled thick, low clouds, painting the marble dome in shades of pale gold and steel gray. Rain clung to the streets like a film of glass, mirroring the storm in the air. Not just in the sky, but in the nation's mood. Washington was awake early, and so was America. Media vans lined the avenues, their satellite dishes turned upward like anxious faces toward heaven, as if even the machines felt the weight of the day. The sidewalks were cluttered with coiled cables, camera tripods, and umbrellas trembling in the wind. Reporters rehearsed their lines under their breath, eyes flicking to monitors that displayed the empty chairs inside the hearing room. For now, the story they would cover today wasn't just another hearing. It was being billed as the moment that could reshape how America defended its industries, its workers, its future. And at its heart were two names the nation had come to know well: J.D. Vance and Karoline Leavitt. The live broadcast began, chirons flashing, historic hearing on American Industrial Sovereignty Act. Live. Inside, the hearing chamber felt like the calm before a hurricane. Polished wood gleamed under cold lighting. Rows of seats waited for the witnesses, the lawmakers, the cameras, and the truth. Then came movement. J.D. Vance stepped through the tall doorway, his figure framed against the storm-filtered light. He didn't rush. His steps were measured, deliberate. He wore a dark suit, unremarkable except for the steelworker's pin glinting faintly on his lapel, a silent reminder of why he'd come. His face was composed, but behind his steady gaze, thoughts raced. They'll try to drown the truth today, in noise and spin, in everything but facts. But I'll be ready. He took his seat, but his eyes roamed the chamber, at the flag standing sentinel in the corner, at the empty chair across from him, where his rival would soon sit, at the rows of microphones that would carry their words to every household, every factory, every farm watching. Outside, viewers leaned closer to their screens. They'd seen J.D. before. They knew his story, the working-class kid who made it to the Senate, who didn't speak often but chose his moments. And this was one of them. Then came Karoline. The cameras swung to catch her arrival. She entered like she owned the room. Shoulders back, smile rehearsed, every inch the polished politician. She paused on the steps, waved to the cameras, her white blazer bright against the dark wood of the chamber. To the world she looked confident, untouchable. But if one watched closely, and millions did, there was a flicker, a second too long between her wave and her step forward. A breath drawn a little deeper than usual. Karoline Leavitt had built her career on charm and precision. Today, she'd need both. Inside her mind, the storm rumbled. This is your stage. He's not going to outshine you. Stick to the plan. As she took her seat across from J.D., the tension between them felt almost visible, like a thread stretched taut across the room. In homes across America, viewers felt it too. a trucker sipping coffee in a Nebraska diner, a retired steelworker in Pittsburgh, a schoolteacher in Michigan, all watching, wondering, what will happen today? Who will stand for us? And as the gavel was lifted, as the first words of the hearing echoed through the chamber and across the airwaves, the nation held its breath. The gavel's sharp crack still echoed faintly when Karoline Leavitt leaned forward, seizing the moment as if it belonged to her. The cameras loved her poise. The lights caught the gleam in her eye. She began smoothly, her voice steady, the practiced tone of someone who had played the stage before. Today, she declared, we are here to talk about America's future, but let's not be fooled by those who would chain that future to the past. Senator Vance speaks of protecting our industries, but what he really proposes is handcuffing innovation, stifling growth, and turning away from the progress that built this nation into the greatest on earth. A murmur rippled through the chamber. The words were sharp, delivered like a well-aimed blade, and J.D. Vance met them with the quiet patience of a man who'd been here before. The camera framed him perfectly. J.D.'s hands folded, his steelworker's pin glinting just enough to catch the eye. He waited for the silence to settle, let the weight of her accusation fill the room, then spoke, his voice low but firm, clear as a bell. Progress, he said, pausing just enough to let the word hang there, isn't measured by stock prices. It's measured by dignity and work, by the strength of the families who rely on these industries, by the towns that thrive or wither based on what we do here today. His words didn't rise in volume, but they carried. Through the chamber, through the cameras, into living rooms and truck cabs and break rooms across America. That single exchange, no more than a minute long, set the tone. The air between them crackled, not with shouting or grandstanding, but with the tension of two opposing visions of the nation. And as J.D.'s steady gaze met Karoline's polished mask, both knew this was no longer about a bill. It was about what kind of America would emerge when the camera stopped rolling. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold still, and then the flood began. The first sound bites clipped, posted, shared within seconds. Vance calls out Wall Street greed, one headline blared. Leavitt defends American innovation, countered another. On social media, the divide grew visible. Hashtags sparking like wildfire. Hashtag stand with JD. Hashtag Leavitt for progress. And in that moment, as the chamber's tension fed the world beyond its walls, the story widened its lens, pulling back just briefly into memory. Flashbacks flickered through JD's mind. A debate stage in Ohio, Karoline's voice rising as she accused him of fear-mongering about foreign trade. A televised roundtable where JD's calm explanations about protecting steelworkers drew eye rolls and interruptions from Karoline's polished rebuttals. A Senate floor session where their clashing speeches lit up the news cycle for days. Every prior battle, every scar earned in this long war of ideals seemed to echo into this room now. And as the hearing pushed on, that history, those scars, gave the present its weight. J.D.'s fingers brushed the edge of the notes before him, not to check facts, but to ground himself. Karoline smoothed an invisible crease in her blazer, eyes flicking to the cameras, calculating every angle. Outside, the rain had begun to fall again, tapping softly at the tall windows, as if reminding everyone inside that the storm hadn't passed. Not out there, and certainly not in here. So when the next question came, when the next volley of words prepared to cross the space between them, it didn't feel like a new moment. It felt like the next chapter in a story America was only beginning to understand. And the viewers watching, breath held once again, leaned closer. The battle wasn't over. It was only beginning. The room remained charged, the weight of their words lingering in the air like the moisture of the storm outside. Karoline adjusted the papers before her fingers moving a shade too quickly, too precisely, as if the perfect arrangement of her notes could steady the tremor she felt building beneath her polished exterior. The smile stayed fixed on her lips, the kind that had charmed donors, disarmed journalists, and convinced millions that she alone could steer America's future. But beneath that practiced expression, a storm brewed, not the one battering the windows, but the one inside her, growing louder with each measured word from J.D. Vance. J.D. said little now. He let the silence do the heavy lifting, knowing that sometimes what you don't say carries the greatest weight. His eyes didn't stray from Karoline's. He wasn't combative. He didn't need to be. Instead, he watched, not with aggression, but with the patient focus of a man who'd spent years reading the small signs that told the real story. And the signs were there. The slight quiver in Karoline's left hand as she turned a page that didn't need turning. The way her gaze darted, just for a second, toward the hearing chair, as if searching for rescue. The faintest catch in her voice as she rattled off a defense of her record. Her words just a little too fast, her tone just a little too bright. Outside the chamber, the social feeds lit up, clips circulating of JD's steady calm and Karoline's thinly veiled agitation. Hashtag JD unshaken. Hashtag Karoline under fire. The nation watched, dissecting every glance, every breath, every stumble. But inside the room, the world narrowed, down to the two of them, locked in a contest of wills beneath the unforgiving lights. JD noticed something else, a subtle inconsistency in Karoline's testimony. She referenced a visit to an American manufacturing plant meant to prove her commitment to domestic industry, but the date she gave didn't match the one from public records. A small thing, to most. But to JD, it was a crack in the armor, a sign that her script wasn't as airtight as she wanted the world to believe. His gaze flicked, just once, to the committee's documents on the table, confirming what he already knew. But he said nothing yet. Not now. Let the tension stretch. Let the storm inside Karoline rage a little longer. And as the next question was raised, a routine query about trade policy on paper, but heavy with implications in the room, Karoline's voice regained some of its practiced rhythm. She smiled again, bright and confident for the cameras. But the storm was there, behind her eyes, and the slight edge of desperation creeping into her tone. The chair of the hearing, an elder statesman with decades of such battles behind him, leaned forward at last, his voice cutting through the growing heat of their exchange. "Keep it civil," he said, his tone a quiet warning, but one that carried all the authority of the nation's gaze. The country's watching, and indeed it was. Every home, every break room, every diner tuned in felt the tension ripple outward. The cameras shifted perspective, pulling back slowly, letting the audience absorb the scene in full. The two figures at odds, the chamber steeped in history and conflict, and behind it all, the American flag standing tall in the corner. Outside, the rain intensified, the drops hammering the windows in a rhythm that seemed to echo the quickening of the nation's collective heartbeat. The storm was far from over, inside or out. The rain's steady percussion against the windows became the soundtrack to a rising storm within the chamber. Karoline sat straighter, her shoulders squaring, the practiced smile gone now, replaced by a more steely determination. She could feel the tension crackling around her, the cameras catching every angle, every micro-expression. But in her mind, the calculation was clear. If J.D. Vance wanted to play the game of quiet resolve, she would flood the room with words, drown him out, seize the narrative. Her voice, when it came, was sharper, louder, edged with the confidence of someone who'd turned the tide in more than one debate before. "Let's not pretend," she began, glancing briefly at the chairman as if to remind the room of the weight of her authority, "that we don't see what's happening here today. Senator Vance isn't here to protect American industry. He's here to pander, to fan the flames of populism, to toss out sound bites crafted for social media instead of solutions crafted for the future." Her words fell fast, clipped, rehearsed, each syllable aimed like an arrow at JD across the table. JD listened, unmoving, his eyes steady on her, his hands still folded. The rain beat harder, the storm outside mirroring the one Karoline tried to summon within these walls. Cameras panned in, capturing the contrast. Karoline's force, JD's calm, and somewhere in that stillness, the power began to shift. Karoline pressed on, sensing perhaps that volume could compensate where substance faltered. This bill, this so-called American Industrial Sovereignty Act, is nothing but a smokescreen, a way to score points with angry voters, to cling to the past while the world moves forward. Senator Vance talks about dignity of work, she sneered, the words sharp with disdain. But what he really means is tying our economy to outdated industries instead of embracing innovation that can actually lift families into the future. For a long second, the chamber held the tension. The weight of her accusation, the force of her onslaught, filled the space. But JD didn't blink. He waited, letting the echoes of her words settle like dust. Then, with the same quiet strength that had unnerved her from the start, he spoke. No rise in volume, no rush, just a voice that carried because it was rooted in something deeper. "I speak of dignity," JD said, his gaze steady on hers, his tone as sure as the flag that stood behind him. "Because I've seen what happens when families lose it, when plants close, and fathers and mothers sit at kitchen tables wondering how to feed their kids. When entire towns hollow out, not because they wouldn't embrace innovation, but because their leaders chose profit over people." His words weren't fiery, but they burned all the same, and they reached beyond Karoline, beyond the senators, out through the cameras into the homes and hearts of those watching. A subtle shift rippled through the room. Senators who had watched the back and forth now exchanged glances, silent acknowledgments that Karoline's attack had overreached, that JD's quiet authenticity carried weight words couldn't match. Even the chairman leaned back slightly, as if giving space for the truth to breathe. Outside, the rain eased for a moment, the storm pausing as if the world itself were listening. Inside, the battle lines had been drawn, but it was clear to those paying attention. This wasn't the easy contest Karoline had expected. The real fight had only begun, and the nation watching could feel it. The chamber held its breath in the wake of JD's quiet, cutting words. The storm outside had softened to a steady drizzle, as if even the rain itself were waiting to see what came next. Karoline sat motionless for the briefest second, her mind racing behind eyes that betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. But JD wasn't done. He hadn't come to trade insults or volume. He had come to do what he always promised his constituents: lay bare the truth piece by piece until it could no longer be denied. He leaned forward slightly, his tone unchanged. No fire, no fury, just the surety of a man who knew his facts. "I respect my colleague's passion," he began, letting his words hang just long enough to disarm the room's tension. "But passion can't rewrite the record. And facts have a way of surfacing." His gaze didn't waver as he reached for the binder in front of him, flipping it open with care, like a craftsman laying out his tools. The first seed was planted gently. JD referenced a vote Karoline had cast 2 years prior, opposing a bill that would have provided relief to domestic steel manufacturers. He read the record, his voice steady, the details clear, no embellishment, just the facts. "That bill would have helped keep 2 plants open in Ohio," JD said, his eyes briefly sweeping the room before returning to Karoline. "Those plants closed within the year. 1,500 jobs, gone. And yet today we hear words of support for working families." The contrast needed no further commentary. Karoline shifted in her seat, fingers tightening on her pen. She interrupted, her voice sharper than before. "Senator Vance, I will not sit here and be lectured on my record by someone who cherry-picks votes and ignores context. That bill was flawed, and you know it." Her words spilled over his, trying to regain control, but the room felt the change, the crack in composure, the urgency in her tone. JD didn't raise his voice. He simply turned the page, another vote, another contradiction, a speech Karoline had given praising free trade agreements, the same agreements that had hastened the closure of factories across the Midwest. He spoke of towns hollowed out, main streets gone dark, not with anger, but with the sorrow of someone who'd walked those streets and shaken those hands. Again, Karoline tried to cut in, her interjections growing more frequent, more insistent. But with each outburst, the mask slipped further. The polished politician who had entered this room, so sure of her footing, now seemed to be grasping for it. The words that once dazzled now landing with less certainty. Outside the chamber, in homes across the country, the shift was felt. Viewers who had tuned in expecting another partisan spectacle now leaned in closer. A farmer in Iowa, a laid-off machinist in Pennsylvania, a grandmother watching with her grandchildren in Michigan, all beginning to see what they hadn't expected. Maybe JD's got a point. And inside the room, that realization hung in the air, unspoken but powerful. JD let the silence do its work, closing his binder softly, as if to say there was more. So much more. But for now, enough had been said. The storm outside had softened, but the storm within the chamber was just beginning to churn. The storm inside the chamber swirled in the heavy silence JD left behind, the quiet after his binder closed somehow louder than Karoline's interruptions. Cameras caught the stillness, but beyond the lens, beyond the polished veneer of the hearing room, the story had deeper roots, moments forged far from the public eye, where the real battle had been quietly waged long before this day. As Karoline shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her mind raced back to the script she'd rehearsed, now fraying at the edges. Her smile felt tighter, her words less certain, and beneath it all, a nagging question took hold. What does he have? What else is he hiding behind that calm? The thought lodged in her like a splinter, impossible to ignore. She tried to focus on the room, the lights, the cameras, but the doubt wouldn't let go. He isn't just here with rhetoric, he's here with something more. And in that space between her fear and his resolve, the story rewound, behind closed doors where JD had prepared for this very moment. Night after night, JD sat alone in his dim office, the glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across stacks of records, voting logs, transcripts, financial disclosures. The city outside his window had long since gone to sleep, but he stayed, tracing connections others had missed or chosen to ignore. His tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up, he flipped through pages marked with notes in the margins. The quiet, unseen labor of a man unwilling to step into that chamber unarmed with the truth. One night, the memory sharp as the chill in the air, he met with a whistleblower, a former aide, eyes hollow from the weight of what they carried. They spoke in a parked car on a side street, voices low, glancing at shadows. The aide handed over a slim folder, hands trembling not from cold, but from fear. And JD thanked them with a nod. No words wasted. He knew the cost of what he now held and the responsibility that came with it. There had been sacrifices, time stolen from family, from sleep, from the small comforts most take for granted. Nights JD walked home past the silent Capitol, wondering if it would matter, if the truth would be enough. But always, always he returned to that desk, to the files, to the mission. Because this wasn't about politics. This was about the people whose voices had been drowned out by the noise of power and profit. Back in the hearing room, JD saw it, the flicker in Karoline's eyes, the question she tried to hide behind practiced confidence. And he knew she felt it too now, the weight of what she didn't know, the dread of what might be coming next. He leaned in slightly, his voice low, not needing volume to carry strength. The chamber seemed to narrow around his words. The truth, he said, steady as the flag that watched over them, has a way of surfacing. Outside, the storm resumed its rhythm against the windows, as if answering the promise in his voice. And across the nation, the viewers leaned even closer, sensing that beneath the surface of this battle, deeper currents were moving, and the real reckoning was yet to come. The chamber seemed to shrink as JD's words settled into the air, his promise of truth surfacing, echoing louder than any shouted accusation might have. Karoline straightened in her chair, adjusting her papers as if rearranging them could fortify her against what was coming. But even as the storm outside kept rhythm against the tall windows, it was the storm inside, quiet, deliberate, unstoppable, that began to take center stage. JD didn't press forward with fire or spectacle. He didn't need to. His strength lay in the calm precision of his questions, each one polite on the surface but with a sharpness beneath that no one in the room could miss. He started simply, with a tone of genuine inquiry that masked the steel beneath. "Senator Leavitt," he said, his voice even, respectful, "could you clarify the nature of the contributions your campaign received last year from the firm Trimark Strategies?" The name alone sent a ripple through the chamber, a firm long rumored to represent interests far from American shores. Karoline's smile returned, but it no longer reached her eyes. "Senator Vance, I'm certain my financial disclosures are all a matter of public record. I've always operated with transparency. Her tone was smooth, her words chosen with care, but JD could see the tension in the way she gripped her pen, the faintest tremor in her fingers. JD nodded thoughtfully, as if satisfied, but his next question followed seamlessly, layered so subtly that the trap was almost invisible. Of course. And can you help us understand how those contributions align with your votes opposing amendments to protect domestic steel subsidies? He spoke softly, giving her space to answer, but the connections he drew were precise, undeniable. Karoline hesitated, just for a beat, enough for the room, and the nation watching, to feel the shift. Senator Vance, I support American workers, but as you well know, those amendments were tied to unrelated provisions that would have harmed our economy. The words came faster now, a practiced defense, but even as she spoke, JD could sense the thread fraying. Outside the chamber, in living rooms and break rooms and cabs idling in truck stops, Americans listened, some for the first time hearing these connections laid bare, their brows furrowing, their doubts stirring. JD saw it in his mind's eye. The families who had lost jobs, the workers whose towns had gone quiet, the faces that filled his thoughts on long nights of preparation. His heart ached with the weight of it all, and with a flicker of doubt. Are they still listening? Have we grown too used to the noise to hear the truth anymore? But he pushed that doubt aside, clinging to hope, to purpose. The questions kept coming, each as courteous as the last, each drawing Karoline deeper. He spoke of other donations, firms tied to foreign conglomerates, interests that had little stake in American communities but much to gain from policies Karoline had championed. And with each question, each connection laid bare, the room grew tighter, the storm outside seeming to drum in time with the steady beat of revelation inside. Karoline answered, but now her words tangled, defenses piling on one another, the grace and polish that had marked her entrance into this chamber, slipping with each polite but unrelenting probe. And JD, calm, steady, let the silence between his questions speak as loudly as the questions themselves. The nation watched, the tension climbing as the trap drew closed, inch by careful inch. The chamber's atmosphere, once filled with the low hum of routine debate, now seemed charged with electricity. JD's questions, delivered with that same unshakable calm, had begun to shift the air itself. Karoline's answers no longer flowed with practiced ease. The subtle cracks were there, in her clipped phrases, in the tightening of her jaw, in the way she gripped the edge of the table, as though bracing herself against a storm she hadn't expected. And as the minutes ticked by, that storm began to break. JD didn't change his tone. He didn't need to. What he brought next wasn't a bombshell. Not at first. Just the kind of detail that seemed innocuous on its face, but when placed in context, took on new and troubling shape. Senator Leavitt, JD said, his voice still courteous, still measured, you opposed emergency protections for domestic steelworkers in April of last year, citing concerns about government overreach. Could you help us understand how that position aligns with the contributions your campaign reported from firms heavily invested in offshoring? A curious vote, highlighted gently but unmistakably. Karoline opened her mouth, her smile brittle now, and offered the beginning of an explanation. But before she could settle into her rhythm, JD continued, turning to another page of his binder as though merely seeking clarity, not pressing advantage. And on your recent disclosure, I believe it was misfiled, listing funds from Trimark as individual contributions rather than PAC donations. A clerical error, I'm sure. Would you care to elaborate? The room shifted palpably. Journalists' pens scratched faster. Cameras zoomed in, hungry for the expressions that would tell the real story beneath the words. Karoline inhaled sharply, blinking once, twice, fighting to keep her composure as JD layered on the final piece. Seemingly small, yet damning in its cumulative weight. And finally, for the record, could you remind us of the purpose of your trip to Geneva last September? The travel wasn't listed on your official itinerary, but perhaps there was an oversight? The question was soft, but the implications loud. Karoline's mask faltered, charm giving way to visible strain. Senator Vance, this is nothing but a string of insinuations, and you know it, she snapped, her voice louder now, her control slipping with every word. You're twisting facts to fit your narrative, and I will not be a target of your theatrics. The murmurs grew, subtle at first, the rustle of notes exchanged, the soft buzz of journalists confirming facts, editors preparing breaking headlines. Karoline's voice filled the space, but no longer in control. Now it echoed with the growing awareness that charm had failed her, that the questions she couldn't easily answer were piling up, their weight pressing down as surely as the storm still lashing at the windows. And JD sat back slightly, binder closed again, letting the silence fall heavy, letting the pressure mount not with force but with truth, piece by careful piece. The nation watched, the trap drawing tighter, as the storm outside and the one within the chamber beat on in tandem. The weight of JD's last question still hung in the air, the storm outside providing a steady, relentless percussion that seemed to mirror the growing unease within the chamber walls. Karoline's voice, once so sure, had begun to falter under the quiet onslaught of fact after fact, the questions that needed no raised tone, no dramatic gesture. And as the murmurs grew in the room, journalists scribbling, cameras zooming, the real shift was happening far beyond those walls, in the living rooms, factories, in veterans' halls of a nation that, perhaps for the first time in a long time, had gone silent to listen. In a modest house on the outskirts of Youngstown, Ohio, a factory worker named Mike sat forward in his worn recliner, calloused hands gripping the armrests. The flicker of the television illuminated his face, his eyes narrowed not in anger but in focused hope. When JD's calm voice floated through the speakers, connecting donations to votes, trips to policies that had gutted his town, Mike clenched his fist without realizing it. "That's for us, right there," he muttered under his breath, as if speaking it aloud would make the moment more real. His teenage son, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside him, looked up, hearing not just the words on the screen, but the conviction in his father's voice. Across the country, in a veterans' hall in Pennsylvania, a group of older men, many in faded jackets adorned with patches and pins, watched in near silence, broken only by the occasional nod or murmur of agreement. They'd seen politicians come and go, heard 1,000 promises made and broken, but something in JD's quiet persistence felt different. It wasn't showmanship. It wasn't empty words. It was a man who seemed to remember the people behind the policies, the faces behind the votes. In a small-town diner in Michigan, the usual clatter of plates and low hum of conversation had given way to near silence. The television above the counter, usually reserved for sports or weather, now held every eye. A waitress paused in pouring coffee, her gaze fixed on the screen as JD's questions built their careful case. The old farmer at the corner booth, who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, tapped his spoon against his mug in quiet rhythm, a gesture of approval more powerful than any speech. And back in the chamber, JD felt it. He didn't see these people, but he knew they were there. In every decision he made, every word he chose, it was their voices that echoed in his mind during those long nights of preparation. The faces of workers laid off, families scraping by, veterans forgotten once the cameras turned away. That was who he spoke for. That was who this moment belonged to. Karoline shifted again, sensing the tide beyond what she could control, the charm that no longer shielded her from the rising wave of doubt. And JD, binder closed, hands resting calmly on the table, looked not at her now, but at the flag behind her, at the symbol of the promise he'd come here to honor. "This," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, carrying beyond the walls and through the airwaves into the homes and hearts of those watching, "is not about me. It's about the promises we keep." Outside, the storm eased for just a moment, as if pausing to listen. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as JD's words echoed in the air. "This is not about me. It's about the promises we keep." The lines settled like a stone in still water, sending ripples not only through those seated in the grand room, but through the homes and hearts of a watching nation. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if summoned by the quiet power of that truth, JD reached once more for his binder. His fingers were steady, the weight of what came next clear in his eyes. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The silence amplified every small sound. The soft click of the binder opening, the faint shuffle of papers, the rain's resumed tapping at the windows. JD looked up, meeting the gaze of the hearing chair. His tone remained measured, respectful, but now carried the unshakable authority of a man who had come prepared. "Mr. Chairman," he began, his voice filling the space without force, "with the committee's permission, I'd like to share with the chamber and with the American people documentation that may shed further light on today's discussion." The chair hesitated only a beat, a flicker of understanding passing between the two men, then nodded. "Proceed, Senator." JD turned toward the staffer manning the projector, giving the smallest nod. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen flickered to life, and the storm outside seemed to draw closer, as if even the rain pressed itself against the glass to witness what came next. The first document appeared, projected large and clear for all to see, a wire transfer confirmation, dated, authenticated, showing a substantial sum routed from an overseas account tied to a foreign conglomerate to a PAC known for supporting Karoline's campaigns. JD said nothing at first, letting the document speak, the numbers and signatures visible to all. A murmur ran through the chamber, quiet at first, then louder as eyes widened, heads turned. Karoline froze, her practiced composure slipping like a mask unfastened at the edges. Her face paled visibly, the color draining as recognition dawned. She opened her mouth, but no words came, her gaze locked on the damning proof displayed for all to see. JD's voice broke the stunned silence, still gentle but now carrying the weight of hard fact. "For months," he said, gesturing to the screen, "this committee has debated the merits of policies meant to protect American industry. What's been less visible, until now, are the interests influencing those debates." The second slide appeared. A contract between a consulting firm with direct ties to Karoline and that same foreign conglomerate. The signatures were clear, the dates aligned with key votes she had cast. The chamber seemed to shrink around the revelation, as if the walls themselves leaned in to bear witness. And then the third image, emails, time-stamped, irrefutable, showing discussions between Karoline's campaign team and representatives of the conglomerate, coordinating talking points meant to downplay the risks of offshoring American jobs. The proof wasn't in fiery accusations or dramatic gestures. It was in the cold clarity of the facts laid bare, piece by piece, until the picture became undeniable. Gasps filled the room. The journalists, who had been scribbling furiously before, now typed in frantic bursts, knowing this was the moment the story would break wide open. Cameras zoomed in on Karoline's face, pale and drawn, the flicker of confidence that had defined her entrance to this hearing now utterly gone. JD didn't look at her. He didn't need to. His eyes rested on the documents, on the truth he had worked so long to bring to light. The storm outside intensified, rain hammering the windows in rhythm with the collective heartbeat of a nation now awake to what lay before them. The storm outside lashed harder against the tall windows, as if the world itself beat in time with the truth now laid bare. Inside the chamber, the glow of the projected documents cast long shadows, stretching across faces turned pale with shock, eyes wide with disbelief. The gasps that had rippled through the room moments earlier gave way to something heavier. Silence. Not the calm kind, but the kind that hums beneath the surface, like a drawn bow held taut, waiting for the next move. Karoline sat frozen for a breath, her fingers trembling just slightly as they clutched the edge of the table. The practiced smile was gone, the easy confidence that had carried her through countless hearings and debates now abandoned, as if it too could not bear the weight of what hovered on the screen behind her. And then, as if summoned by instinct or desperation, she found her voice. But it came not with the clarity of control, but with the tremor of a ship taking on water. This is outrageous," she began, the words tumbling over themselves, a stammer where once there had been polish. "These documents, Senator Vance, you know as well as I do that donations are common in politics. This is a smear, a manufactured attack to distract from your own failures to present real solutions." Her eyes darted across the chamber, seeking an ally, a lifeline, but found none. The senators who might once have nodded in agreement now watched in silence, their expressions unreadable, their attention fixed on the unfolding collapse. The journalists leaned forward, pens still, recorders capturing every word, every crack in the facade. JD said nothing. He didn't need to. His binder remained closed now, his hands folded, his gaze steady. He let the evidence speak, knowing that the power of truth needed no embellishment. The documents on the screen, the wire transfer, the contract, the emails, stood as silent witnesses, their details irrefutable, their implications clear. The more Karoline tried to fill the space with words, the more those words seemed to fall flat, absorbed by the weight of what could no longer be denied. She tried again, her voice rising, too loud in the stillness. You talk about integrity, Senator Vance, but where is yours? You've cherry-picked data, taken things out of context, and now you expect this committee, the American people, to believe. Her sentence faltered, unfinished, as her own words seemed to betray her. The room's energy tightened further, the tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls themselves. No one interrupted. No one came to her defense. The storm beyond the glass became the only sound, a relentless rhythm that seemed to count down the moments until the inevitable. JD remained silent, his stillness more powerful than any rebuttal. He understood what was happening, knew the collapse unfolding before him was not his to hasten, but simply to witness. His restraint drew the contrast sharper, her flailing words against his quiet resolve, her unraveling against his unshaken calm. And as Karoline sank back into her chair at last, breath shallow, eyes downcast, the chamber remained frozen in that stunned, suspended moment. The bow was drawn, but no arrow loosed. The truth had been enough. The storm, outside and in, raged on. The silence in the chamber was absolute, the kind of silence that seems to vibrate with everything unsaid, the truth hanging in the air like a thundercloud just waiting to break. Karoline sat motionless, the weight of the evidence, of her own failed denials, pressing down on her shoulders. The storm beyond the windows seemed to soften for a breath, as if the world itself leaned closer, waiting for what came next. JD's eyes never left the flag behind Karoline, as if drawing strength from the symbol, from the promise it represented, the promise he had come here to defend. And then, with no raised voice, no flourish of drama, he spoke the words that would echo far beyond this chamber, beyond this moment, across a nation that had been waiting, perhaps longer than it realized, to hear them. Corruption doesn't wear a mask forever, JD said, his voice low but caring, steady as the rain that traced rivulets down the glass. Today, the mask fell. The words didn't explode. They didn't need to. They sank deep, the kind of truth that resonates because it's undeniable, because it says what so many have felt but could not voice. And in that instant, something shifted. Not in the room alone, but across the country. In Ohio, the factory worker who had clenched his fist earlier now let it fall softly against the arm of his chair, his chest rising with a breath he hadn't known he was holding. His teenage son looked at him, seeing the glint of moisture in his father's eyes, understanding in that unspoken moment what this fight had meant. In a veterans' hall in Pennsylvania, the old soldier sat straighter, as if the words had rekindled a fire they thought long gone. A man with silver hair and a weathered face wiped at his eye with the back of his hand, muttering, "Finally, someone said it." In small-town diners, living rooms, break rooms, the reaction was the same. A quiet catharsis, a collective exhale, cheers in some places, tears in others. The line carried not because it was clever, but because it was true, because it had been earned not with spectacle, but with perseverance, with the slow, steady, painful work of bringing the truth to light. Back in the chamber, the journalists captured it all. The stillness, the power of the moment, the faces of senators who now understood they had witnessed something that would not fade when the cameras turned off. And the cameras, they captured Karoline too, her hands trembling just visibly where they rested on the table, her gaze fixed on nothing at all. The realization had settled over her, cold and final. It was over. The mask had fallen, and beneath it, there was no place left to hide. JD didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply sat back, his work done for now, letting the words hang where they belonged. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder, a marker of the moment when the truth finally broke through. Outside, the storm eased to a soft patter, as if even the rain knew it was time to rest. The gavel's sharp crack still echoed faintly when Karoline Leavitt leaned forward, seizing the moment as if it belonged to her. The cameras loved her poise. The lights caught the gleam in her eye. She began smoothly, her voice steady, the practiced tone of someone who had played this stage before. Today, she declared, we are here to talk about America's future. But let's not be fooled by those who would chain that future to the past. Senator Vance speaks of protecting our industries, but what he really proposes is handcuffing innovation, stifling growth, and turning away from the progress that built this nation into the greatest on earth. A murmur rippled through the chamber. The words were sharp, delivered like a well-aimed blade, and J.D. Vance met them with the quiet patience of a man who'd been here before. The camera framed him perfectly. J.D.'s hands folded, his steelworker's pin glinting just enough to catch the eye. He waited for the silence to settle, let the weight of her accusation fill the room, then spoke, his voice low but firm, clear as a bell. Progress, he said, pausing just enough to let the word hang there, isn't measured by stock prices. It's measured by dignity and work, by the strength of the families who rely on these industries, by the towns that thrive or wither based on what we do here today. His words didn't rise in volume, but they carried through the chamber, through the cameras, into living rooms and truck cabs and break rooms across America. That single exchange, no more than a minute long, set the tone. The air between them crackled, not with shouting or grandstanding, but with the tension of two opposing visions of the nation. And as JD's steady gaze met Karoline's polished mask, both knew this was no longer about a bill. It was about what kind of America would emerge when the cameras stopped rolling. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold still, and then the flood began. The first sound bites clipped, posted, shared within seconds. Vance calls out Wall Street greed, one headline blared. Leavitt defends American innovation, countered another. On social media, the divide grew visible, hashtags sparking like wildfire. Hashtag stand with JD, hashtag leave it for progress. And in that moment, as the chamber's tension fed the world beyond its walls, the story widened its lens, pulling back just briefly into memory. Flashbacks flickered through JD's mind. A debate stage in Ohio, Karoline's voice rising as she accused him of fear-mongering about foreign trade. A televised roundtable where JD's calm explanations about protecting steelworkers drew eye rolls and interruptions from Karoline's polished rebuttals. A Senate floor session where their clashing speeches lit up the news cycle for days. Every prior battle, every scar earned in this long war of ideals seemed to echo into this room now. And as the hearing pushed on, that history, those scars, gave the present its weight. JD's fingers brushed the edge of the notes before him, not to check facts, but to ground himself. Karoline smoothed an invisible crease in her blazer, eyes flicking to the cameras, calculating every angle. Outside, the rain had begun to fall again, tapping softly at the tall windows, as if reminding everyone inside that the storm hadn't passed. Not out there, and certainly not in here. So when the next question came, when the next volley of words prepared to cross the space between them, it didn't feel like a new moment. It felt like the next chapter in a story America was only beginning to understand. And the viewers watching, breath held once again, leaned closer. The battle wasn't over. It was only beginning. The room remained charged, the weight of their words lingering in the air, like the moisture of the storm outside. Karoline adjusted the papers before her fingers moving a shade too quickly, too precisely, as if the perfect arrangement of her notes could steady the tremor she felt building beneath her polished exterior. The smile stayed fixed on her lips, the kind that had charmed donors, disarmed journalists, and convinced millions that she alone could steer America's future. But beneath that practiced expression, a storm brewed. Not the one battering the windows, but the one inside her, growing louder with each measured word from J.D. Vance. And through it all, J.D. remained seated, his face as steady as it had been since the start. He didn't gloat, didn't look away, didn't shrink from the sight. His expression carried the weight of the moment, not triumph, but the sober responsibility of a man who had fought for the truth not to destroy a person, but to uphold a promise. His eyes followed as the agents gently guided Karoline from the table, her steps unsteady, the cuffs at her wrists a stark symbol of the fall from power to accountability. Outside the chamber, the rain fell in sheets now, the storm renewed, as if the skies themselves marked the gravity of what had transpired. Across the country, those watching felt the chill of that metallic click as if it had echoed in their own homes, in their own hearts. A reminder that justice, though often slow, could not be outrun forever. And as the doors closed behind Karoline, leaving only the storm's voice, in the stunned silence of the room, J.D. exhaled. Not in relief, but in quiet acknowledgement of the cost of what had just been done. The heavy doors of the chamber closed behind Karoline, the metallic echo of their latch reverberating like a final note in a song no one had wanted to hear. The room remained still for a long moment, the collective breath of those inside held as if in respect for the gravity of what had just unfolded. But beyond those walls, the storm that had raged quietly now broke loose in the streets, in the media, and in the hearts of a nation no longer watching in silence. Outside the Capitol, reporters surged forward, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of questions, of analysis, of urgent declarations. "A stunning fall from grace," shouted one correspondent, eyes bright behind rain-speckled glasses. "Justice at last or political theater?" mused another, notebook clutched tight against the downpour. Cameras pivoted, microphones thrust toward anyone willing to speak. Their feeds beamed across the country to a public hungry for answers, for meaning, for resolution in the face of what they had just witnessed. The streets filled with debate, not the angry shouts of division, but the earnest, bewildered conversations of a people grappling with the weight of what had transpired. In cafes, on sidewalks, in cabs idling at intersections, voices rose and fell as Americans asked the questions that now hung heavy in the air. Was this justice long overdue, a restoration of faith in the system? Or was it betrayal, the destruction of a once promising figure laid low by forces greater than herself? The storm outside seemed to echo the storm within, the rain mingling with the tears of some, with the defiant glares of others, as the nation searched for its footing in the wake of truth laid bare. And through it all, J.D. Vance emerged from the chamber, alone, unguarded, the media frenzy parting for a breath as he stepped into the storm's embrace. The cameras swung toward him, questions fired like volleys. "Senator Vance, do you feel vindicated? Was this your goal all along? What do you say to Karoline's supporters tonight?" But J.D. didn't stop, didn't raise his voice to claim the moment. His steps were measured, steady, his face carrying not triumph, but the quiet burden of a man who had fought not for headlines, but for what was right. The rain drenched his suit, ran down the steelworker's pin on his lapel, but he didn't seem to notice. He moved through the storm as if it were a natural extension of the battle he had just waged. No longer the storm of accusation and denial, but the cleansing storm that follows when truth has finally broken through. The Capitol loomed behind him, its lights glowing soft against the dark sky, the flag above it snapping in the wind as if in silent salute. And then, beneath the cover of the rain's steady rhythm, J.D. paused at the base of the steps, the cameras still trained on him, the nation still watching. His voice was low, meant not for the microphones but for himself, and perhaps for those who might one day look back on this moment and wonder what drove him through the storm. "For the people," he whispered, the words nearly lost to the wind. "Always." And with that, he moved on, leaving the storm, the questions, and the nation's reckoning to unfold as it must. The storm outside Washington's marble halls began to recede, but the storm inside America's living rooms, airwaves, and headlines was only just gathering strength. J.D.'s figure disappearing into the rain with that soft, resolute whisper, "For the people. Always." became the closing image for nearly every news broadcast that night. And with it, the firestorm began, fierce and relentless, as the nation tried to make sense of what it had witnessed. Talk shows lit up the airwaves. On one channel, a commentator leaned forward at his desk, eyes blazing with fervor. This, he declared, was justice in action. J.D. Vance didn't just win a debate today. He reminded this country what integrity looks like. The audience in the studio, and those watching at home, nodded along, many wiping tears they hadn't expected to shed. Clips of J.D.'s quiet dismantling of corruption played in endless loops. His words, "Corruption doesn't wear a mask forever. Today, the mask fell." Quoted in bold across screens, printed on banners, transformed into hashtags spreading like wildfire. But on another network, the tone was different. A panel of pundits spoke over one another, voices sharp with skepticism. "Let's not kid ourselves," one analyst said, gesturing toward footage of Karoline being led away in cuffs. This was theater. Vance orchestrated a spectacle to build his brand. Where's the due process? Where's the presumption of innocence? Another chimed in, nodding. Sure, the documents look damning, but let's not forget, politics is a dirty game. Who benefits most from this downfall? Podcasts dropped emergency episodes, their hosts dissecting every frame of the hearing, every word, every flicker of expression on JD's and Karoline's faces. Some praised JD's discipline, his refusal to grandstand, the way he let evidence speak instead of ego. Others questioned what hadn't been shown, what pieces of the puzzle might still be missing, what motivations might lurk beneath even the most noble-seeming actions. The headlines the next morning told the story of a nation divided yet transfixed. Vance topples Titan, a new standard of courage, read one. Political assassination or justice served, asked another. Editorial pages filled with columns lauding JD as a hero of the people or warning against the dangers of trial by public opinion. The debate reached far beyond the Capitol, carried on the voices of morning show hosts, late-night comedians, and ordinary citizens calling into radio shows or posting on social media, eager to weigh in. Supporters of JD rallied, seeing in him a rare figure who had chosen truth over convenience, who had stood alone against power and prevailed. They shared clips, wrote messages of gratitude, and spoke of him in the same breath as past giants who had fought for the people over the powerful. Critics, meanwhile, scoured every detail of the hearing, every moment of JD's calm takedown, hunting for inconsistencies, for evidence that might dull the sharpness of his victory or expose it as something less pure than it seemed. And through it all, JD remained silent. No victory tour, no grand statements to the cameras. The image of him walking alone in the storm, the weight of justice his only companion, was all he allowed the media to have. And that, in its own way, only fueled the fire further. The nation was captivated, divided, but united in one truth. No one could look away. The storm of debate had only just begun. As the media storm raged across airwaves and headlines, J.D. Vance retreated from the noise, slipping into a quiet conference room deep within the Capitol's old stone walls. The space was simple, polished oak table, high windows still streaked with the remnants of rain, but it offered something rare in the aftermath of such public spectacle, a moment of stillness. Around the table sat his closest allies, staffers who had stood by him through sleepless nights of preparation, a handful of fellow senators who had quietly lent their support, and friends who believed not just in the man, but in the cause. JD remained standing, palms pressed against the table's edge as he spoke, his voice low but steady. What happened today, he began, pausing to let the words settle, was a step, a necessary step. But it wasn't the victory. The real fight, that's ahead of us. The act still has to pass. The protections, the reforms, the promises we made, none of that is done. His gaze moved from face to face, making sure each person understood that the moment they had all witnessed, as powerful as it was, could not be the end of their effort. JD let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His shoulders sagged just slightly, the armor of resolve slipping enough to reveal the toll beneath. I won't pretend it didn't cost something, he said, his voice quieter now, the weight of honesty heavier in private. Every night I asked myself if it would matter, if people would hear through the noise, if standing up would change anything or just paint a bigger target on my back. He looked out the window, the Capitol dome visible in the distance, framed by storm-dark clouds. And I wondered if I had it in me to see it through. His friend said nothing, just stood beside him, offering presence where no words were needed. And in that space, JD straightened again, the flicker of vulnerability passing, but not forgotten. He knew the fight wasn't over, that it never really would be, but for a moment, the burden was shared. The path ahead made a little clearer by the simple truth that he didn't walk it alone. Outside, the storm gave way to dawn's first light, the Capitol's flag lifting gently in the breeze, as if to remind them both that the promise JD had made, for the people, still waited to be fulfilled. The storm that had shrouded Washington gave way to a soft gray sky as JD traveled out of the city, leaving behind the marble and media, the noise and the headlines. The car ride was quiet, no staffers briefing him, no reporters trailing behind, just the hum of the road beneath tires and the weight of everything that had passed. JD stared out the window at fields waking beneath the dawn, the landscape shifting from cityscape to small-town resilience. It was here, in these places far from the glare of the Capitol, that the fight had always truly mattered. The factory wasn't large or grand. It was the kind of building that had seen better decades, its red brick walls weathered by rain and time, but its heartbeat steady in the sound of machinery, the hum of work returning where silence had once reigned. As JD stepped from the car, the air smelled of steel, oil, and promise, and it filled his lungs in a way the polished halls of power never could. Workers greeted him as he crossed the lot, not with cheers or fanfare, but with nods of respect, handshakes that spoke of gratitude without needing words. These were the faces he'd carried with him into every long night at his desk, into every quiet decision, every choice to stand his ground when it might have been easier not to. Faces lined by years of labor, eyes that measured a man not by his speeches, but by whether he kept his word. Near the entrance, an older man in a worn jacket stepped forward, his cap marked with the insignia of a veteran's post. His handshake was firm, his voice low but sure. "You remembered us," he said simply, no ceremony in it, just truth, raw and real. JD felt the weight of the moment settle over him, not as a burden, but as a reminder. He looked around at the men and women who had gathered, at the factory that had flickered back to life, at the quiet dignity of work resumed. His gaze lifted to the flag that waved gently from a pole above the office door, weathered but proud, and in that instant, all the noise and debate, the sleepless nights and stormy hearings, fell into place. "This," he said, more to himself than to those around him, voice soft but certain, "is who I serve." And the day went on, the work continued, and the promise endured. The city slept under a sky washed clean by the night's storm, the streets glistening under the glow of lamplight, the air cool and heavy with the scent of rain. JD walked alone, his footsteps soft against the stone paths that wove through the heart of the Capitol. The Capitol dome rose ahead, lit against the dark, a beacon and a burden all at once, its light reflected in the puddles at his feet, fractured and shifting with each step, much like the path of truth he had chosen to walk. The storm inside him hadn't cleared with the skies. The cost of truth weighed on him now, heavier than during the hearing, heavier than during the silence that had followed Karoline's fall. Every word he'd spoken, every document he'd revealed, every choice to hold the line, they had all come at a price. The price of sleepless nights, of friendships strained, of knowing that for every battle won, another waited just beyond the horizon. His mind turned over the questions that had haunted him in quiet hours. Had he done enough? Could any man ever do enough? And what of the toll on those who stood beside him, who bore the weight without the recognition? He paused before a small memorial, a plaque and sculpture dedicated to laborers who had built the city with their hands, their sweat, their lives. JD reached up and touched the steelworker's pin on his lapel, the cold metal grounding him. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a promise, one he meant to keep. The city around him breathed in the night, the storm having given way to stillness, And JD stood a moment longer, letting the weight settle before he moved on. Each step a quiet vow to continue, no matter how heavy the duty. The next morning, JD sat in a small room. No grand podium, no sea of cameras. Just him, a plain backdrop, and the quiet hum of a recording device. He'd been urged to deliver a major speech, to seize the moment, to brand his victory. But JD had refused the spectacle. This wasn't about him. It never had been. He looked into the lens, his gaze steady, his words measured. "My fellow Americans," he began, voice low but firm. "Justice is not loud, it is not easy, and it is not quick. Justice is steady work. It's ours to protect, not just with laws, but with the choices we make, the truth we insist on seeing, the promises we refuse to break." There were no dramatic pauses, no sweeping gestures, just clarity, just truth. What happened this week was not an ending. It was a reminder. We must choose justice every day, because if we don't, no one else will. The video went live with little fanfare, but the nation was ready to listen. It spread within hours, shared across divides, across ideologies, across communities that had long stopped believing they shared anything at all. JD's simple words echoed in homes from rural towns to city blocks, in union halls, in classrooms, in quiet corners where people had begun to wonder if integrity still had a place in public life. And in that moment, at least, they believed again. The Capitol buzzed in the days that followed, the storm of media frenzy giving way to the grind of governance. JD didn't seek the cameras, didn't ride the wave of attention. He went to work, meeting with allies and skeptics alike, pushing forward the American Industrial Sovereignty Act. The battle was far from over, but now doors that had once been closed open, ears that had once been deaf to his arguments listen. There were no grand speeches on the floor, no declarations of victory. JD knew better than to mistake a single stand for a war won. But as amendments were debated, as provisions were shaped, he worked, quietly, steadily, as he always had. And with each day the act advanced, not because of spectacle, not because of scandal, but because of truth, hard-won and undeniable. One morning, long after the hearing had faded from headlines, but not from memory, JD stood on the steps of the Capitol as dawn broke. The first light touched his face, soft and golden, the city still quiet in its early hour. Above him, the flag lifted in the morning breeze, bright against the pale sky. JD took a breath, the weight of the moment filling him not with pride, but with purpose. And as the sun rose over the city he served, over the nation he fought for, he spoke the words that had guided him from the start, a whisper meant for himself, for the people, for the future. Truth wins, but only because we choose it. This story reminds us that truth isn't always loud, and justice doesn't always come with applause. JD Vance's journey shows how integrity, patience, and quiet strength can break through even the strongest walls of corruption. It's not about grand speeches or public praise. It's about the steady work of keeping promises and standing up for those whose voices are often unheard. In a world full of noise, it's the quiet choices that shape our future. JD's legacy reminds us that real change begins with courage and the will to choose truth again and again. What about you? When was a time you stood up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy? We'd love to hear your story. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.